They must just be here for an intervention. Sorry? Order. Order. Damien Hines to move the motion.
It's a huge pleasure to see you presiding over us today. I want to talk about housing targets for rural England in general, but also for my constituency of East Hampshire in particular, and to talk about three dimensions. The first is about the balance of development between urban areas and rural areas. This is a general point about the whole of the country, the rural versus town balance, but has particular significance in my area. I believe with the new formula, there is too much emphasis towards building in the countryside, which will be bad for economic growth, bad for our decarbonisation agenda, and of course, injurious to the countryside. Now, I'm going to ask the government to look again at that formula. The second is about the types of housing, the mix of housing, which it is incentivised to build, which means that we don't end up getting the mix weighted enough towards the more affordable housing that we so badly need. And third, I want to talk about something which is specific to my constituency, which is about the balance of development within the area, because we have a national park boundary that cuts through. And whatever the overall numbers are, there is that question of balance within the specific area. But look, by way of background, we all know we need more homes. And let's not have a discussion about which party is more serious about needing that we need more homes. We need more homes. We had figures out yesterday projecting a very big population increase over the next few years, 4.9 million over the next 10 years, driven by net immigration. Now, those numbers are too high, and we need to bring them down. But in any case, there is already the pressure from the population growth and household demand growth that we have had, which is partly to do with net immigration, but is also to do with other factors, including people living longer and what's called the tendency towards smaller household formation. So yes, we all care about housing, and I would just mention that if you look at what are the four biggest or highest completion numbers since 1997, of those four, three of them have been since 2019 under Conservative governments. Now, the government wants to increase to 370,000 a year and has changed the formula to do that last month. That would, I think, be by some margin, the highest number of completions for a very, very long time. I think the highest since 1997 in a single calendar year was about 180,000 compared to 370. So there are doubts about how realistic these targets really are, especially given constraints on the supply side, both in terms of labour with a small L and in terms of materials. But if it is going to be done, it's exceptionally important for public confidence, and as MPs we hear this the whole time, that it must be accompanied by not just the promise of, but the delivery of the right services and infrastructure. And it is true that most of those services, of course, are statutory requirements. So, sewerage will come because it is a requirement. County councils, my own in Hampshire, does a very good job on place planning and predicting where places are going to be needed. We know that funding for GPs follows the population and so on. But there are still, as I think all MPs have heard, there are still worries and doubts about the timeliness of that. And particularly if you've got a sudden massive increase in the amount of building that's going to happen, a worry that, well, if there's a shortage of builders, let's say, how do we know that there's going to be prioritisation for the school or the GP surgery that needs to be built over the houses?
Will my right honourable friend give way?
I will, of course.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way on that point. This is exactly the issue faced in my own constituency at the moment, with planning going through at the moment with regards to two large developments. One proposed for Wash Road, just on the outskirts of Noak Bridge, and another which went through last week, a couple of weeks ago, for Langdon Road in Billericay. the huge local pressures on local services. The local primary schools are overflowing, and particularly around Section 106 money, when we're actually going to be seeing our councils changing from two-tier to a unitary authority, with those councils being moved around. There's real concern that Section 106 money won't even be going to those local needs for those communities who are having the housing imposed on them. So would my right honourable friend agree that it adds an extra complexity to the situation here as well?
I agree with him. It certainly does, and he's done an outstanding job of highlighting these points, including on the floor of the House of Commons, to the benefit of his constituents. It's also very important that we pay attention to maintaining the character of different areas. And we've talked many times in the past about urban sprawl. We increasingly have a risk of a sort of rural sprawl, where you end up with these ribbon developments and lose the distinction between different settlements. In my own constituency, as well as being a beautiful landscape, we also have an important cultural heritage, particularly having been the home of Jane Austen. And that is very important not only to people who live in East Hampshire, but also to many, many people who visit East Hampshire from elsewhere in the country, and indeed from abroad as well. So, look, the new formula, so the government needs an overall 50% uplift in housing numbers, but in many areas it goes up by a lot more than that. And my area, East Hampshire, is one of them. Our target goes up from 575 to 1,142. It's an increase of 98%. Let's just call it doubling. But that's not that unusual. The library paper that colleagues will have seen looked at 58 mainly or largely rural local authorities. It found that all of them had an increase, two-thirds of them had an increase above 50%. The average increase in those rural areas in the target was 71%. Meanwhile, for urban areas, the increase is much, much lower, more like 16 or 17% on average, and quite a few places actually see a fall, including large parts of London and Birmingham. And again, the library analysis found that 37 out of the 41 local authorities with a decrease were urban. And I want to stress this is not about a north-south divide, it's specifically an urban-rural divide, because the County Council network has helpfully provided us with some figures showing the difference in county areas. In fact, compared to the South East, the North East, North West and Yorkshire and the Humber have much, much higher average increases for them, albeit from a lower base. It's also important to note this is not about correcting a historic mistake. I think sometimes people may think, oh, building hasn't happened very much in the countryside in the past. In fact, if you look back, not just over a couple of years, but over 20 years, the rate of building, so the number of additional dwellings relative to the existing kind of per 1,000 households, has been higher in predominantly rural areas than in predominantly urban areas. And as I say, that shift from urban to rural is a problem for multiple reasons. One of them, and this is a big theme, of course, today, is about economic growth. And the Resolution Foundation, a think tank which I'm sure the Minister has a lot of time for, their analysis says that tilting development towards cities because of agglomeration effect and other factors makes a material improvement to growth prospects. It's also important, though, for another theme of the day, and we talk about, for example, airport expansion and what can be the tension between economic growth and decarbonisation. In fact, when you get housing moving towards the countryside, that is bad for decarbonisation because the numbers are so high. It means effectively you have to put houses like everywhere. You can't just focus on the relatively small number of places that have good strategic council transport links. So you are hardwiring reliance on the motor car, and in constituencies like mine, that means 2 cars per couple in a household. So why does the formula do this? Look, we haven't got time. We would need whiteboards and Excel and possibly PhDs to do it, to go through this subject. Possibly, Mr. Jordan, you already have a PhD in this subject. I don't want to suppose otherwise. But various changes have been made to the formula, and in particular, the multiplier that gets applied to the affordability calculation has gone up from 0.6 times to 0.95 times. And that means that the affordability calculation does a lot more work. It's a lot more important than it was before. And it is important to note that no calculation of affordability of housing is perfect. In fact, nowhere close to perfect. There are all manner of problems when you try to make such a calculation. And in particular, with the formula we use today, there is a proper debate to be had about the balance between workplace earnings and residency-based earnings. Sometimes we talk about a choice between the two. Actually, I think they are both relevant when we consider the affordability of housing. Also about the distinction between earnings and income, and whether we are really comparing like-for-like types of housing. Now, as I say, this is not the place to discuss those in detail. It's not possible in a debate format. But what I would say to the Minister is, the formula, I'm sure, looked logical when it was done on paper or on a computer screen. I'm sure it was, and done for the right reasons. But it has, in practice, delivered perverse outcomes, which will reduce the amount of housing development in urban areas, will harm growth, and will be extremely difficult to deliver, and certainly impossible, I would say, to deliver sustainably in the countryside. It's an errant algorithm, a rogue algorithm, and we know what that feels like, because that happened when we were in government too. It can happen to anyone. The important thing is, when you spot it, the best thing to do is to address it as quickly as possible. So whatever the intent was, looking at the outcome, I'd ask them to look again. The second issue is that the formula doesn't encourage sufficiently a change in the mix towards actually affordable homes. And I'll say what I mean by actually affordable in a moment. I first just want to note the good work of my constituent Nick Stenning, who has helped me in this area. So we do want there to be more affordable homes. But when constituents come to my surgery and say they want housing to be more affordable, they don't mean it in the sense that the public sector means it, what I call capital A affordable, the very strict definition of housing association rent, council rent, part ownership. They mean they just want a home they can afford. And that includes, of course, those types of tenure, and includes rent, but actually still, young couples actually overwhelmingly aspire to own their home, and we should be in the business of helping them to do that. But for a developer, other things being equal, the best economic returns come from larger, costlier houses. And when you add that together with the fact that there is a premium anyway on new build homes as opposed to existing stock, this means paradoxically that in spite of the kind of economic theory, paradoxically when you add more homes, the median price goes up because you're adding them in the top half of the distribution. And so then you get a cycle which ends up calling for more of the same. Says, well, this area is now even less affordable than it was before, and so we need more houses, and you get more of those same, not entirely, of course, there is a mix, but disproportionately toward the 4- or 5-bed executive home type. So again, I've just asked, and I think I'm sure we'd have the same objective entirely in this regard. I'd ask ministers to look again at that. And the third and final area I wanted to cover is this one specific to my constituency, although it applies to a lesser extent in other areas with so-called national landscapes, but only one or two literally in the country to quite the extent it does in mine. And I should say at the outset that the national park in question, the South Downs National Park, is an unusual national park. It is England's newest, but it is by far the most populous. So the population density is about 3.5 times the density of the next most dense population, which is the Lake District. And it does have huge swathes of open countryside, but it also has significantly sized settlements, one of which, for example, in my constituency is Petersfield. So we have a town called Petersfield inside the national park. I have another town called Alton outside the national park. They are both of similar size. They are both historic market towns with many of the same needs, many of the same objectives of people living there, but are treated completely differently from the point of view of housing development. Now, of course, there would be no point in having national parks if they did not have special protection. But the problem I have in an area like mine is because I've got so much, it's 57% by land area of the district is inside the national park, 43% is outside, but when you're calculating the housing need, you have to calculate it on the basis of the entire area, but overwhelmingly that need then has to be accommodated just in the area which is outside of the national park. And then, when you get a change, so like we've just had the number go up, if the numbers that can be accommodated inside the national park don't change, then you get a magnified effect, a leveraged effect, in the part of the district outside of the national park. Now, you wouldn't expect development to be in proportion to landmass, otherwise we'd have an awful lot more building in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency, for example. Other things being equal, you would expect it to be broadly in proportion, and is, broadly in proportion to the existing development, to where the existing population is. And with the South Downs National Park in the district of East Hampshire, the national park accounts for 27% of the population. Historically, up till now, it has accounted for 15% of the housing development since the national park came into existence. But now, with the change in targets, without that much changing in what the national park's planning to do, it will be 8% of the housing development, as against 27% of the existing population. And that creates particular pressures, as you would imagine, Mrs. Jardine, just outside, just by the boundary of the national park. And that means places like Alton and Hollybourne, Four Marks and Medstead, all the way along the A31, and in the south of the district, around Horndean, Clanfield and Rowlands Castle. And there is already an imbalance in affordability of housing inside and outside the national park, as was demonstrated by the bespoke analysis the Office for National Statistics kindly produced. And that imbalance will widen over time, which has implications also for things like the age mix of people living inside the national park, and therefore for the viability of schools, of churches, of shops, of pubs, and so on. My honourable friend. Yes.
He's been very generous in giving way. And I think this also goes back to touch on his previous point around that balance between urban and rural, and perhaps densification in the future as well. It's actually these actual semi-rural areas and rural areas which are now being densified, and given the fact that the changes in the requirements are new buildings in places like London, which is seeing less extra densification going on there. And so would you agree with me that actually the government should be looking at schemes like that, which the Industry and Parliament Trusts are going to take us on a visit to in the next few weeks, up at Finsbury Park, where an estate, post-war estate of 2,000 homes, is being transformed into 5,500 homes, a proper urban densification around a major existing transport hub, which means that those houses aren't going to be built in that greenbelt areas you're talking about.
I think he makes a very interesting point. Actually, we have on a much smaller scale, we have a good example of that locally in my constituency as well. And in fact, sometimes you can do this and really materially improve amenity. Exactly. So you make a better looking housing estate, and if you can add facilities, you can add a shop, even a pub, and so on, then that could be to the benefit, and better children's playgrounds and so on, then that could be to the benefit of everyone. I don't know, I'm coming close to the end, you'll be relieved to hear. I don't want to overstate matters. The South Downs National Park Authority do build houses. In fact, they build more houses, or plan for more houses than other national park authorities. They do cooperate with, they do communicate with East Hampshire District Council, but you still end up with this imbalance. And I think the imbalance, the extent of it, is bad both for the part inside and the part outside the national park. But whatever that balance was going to be, there's also the question of public confidence and democratic accountability and responsiveness, and people knowing how these numbers have been derived, rather than the council effectively having to be a number taker, as it were, because of the decisions of another group. So although my primary ask of the Minister is to look again overall how numbers are distributed between urban areas and the countryside, I also really want to ask him to look again at how this calculation works within an area like mine. So we don't have demand calculated for the entire district, but supply being able, mostly, not entirely, but mostly only been able to go in one part. And I think there are different ways that you could rectify it. One would be to give district councils total clarity on how they can adjust their method without running a method of calculation of need, without running an excessive risk of the plan being found to be unsound. Now, the Minister may have this in his notes. There is guidance, but here's what it says. The standard method should be used to assess housing needs. However, in the specific circumstances where an alternative approach could be justified, such as those explained in paragraph 40, which is national parks, consideration will be given to whether it provides the basis for a plan that is positively prepared, taking into account the information available on existing levels of housing stock and housing affordability. Well, Mrs. George, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I could explain to somebody else what that means. So if we're going to have guidance, then fine. But it has to be, but it has to be clear. It has to give confidence to councils and councillors who at the end of the day are managing public money, that they are not running a serious risk of ending up in court proceedings because of trying to do the right thing. But it could also be done other ways. It could be done by having the national park itself explicitly and transparently set a housing target for the entirety of its area, leaving the individual districts to work it out for theirs. And they could either do that individually for each district or just for the park as a whole. I will, yes.
Just on that point, I mean, he's not mentioned the rural exceptions policies. He's talking about rural housing. And in order to achieve the kind of outcome that he's describing there, surely he should be advancing the importance of rural exceptions schemes, because on the edges of towns and villages, there's massive hope value if the targets are high, whereas under rural exception schemes, one can keep the development land price down by ensuring that those developments meet local need.
He makes a very good point, and has been a long. I've seen him in two, and it's both his incarnations. He's long been a campaigner on these issues. There are many things I would love to talk about housing and development. As it is, I'm running out of time just talking about these three, so I hope he'll forgive me if I stick to that. But I do agree about the exceptions policy and potential that is there. My further question to the Minister is, with devolution and local government reorganisation, how and when may some of these questions anyway change, because we are looking at things on different boundaries? I'm very grateful to him for agreeing to meet with me and my district council to talk specifically about that national parks issue, but I do hope he'll be able to give full consideration to all the points I've raised today. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate, and if I could ask you to limit your remarks to 5 to 6 minutes, please. The question is that this House has considered housing targets in rural areas. Joe Morris.
Thank you, and your chairship, and I'd genuinely like to thank the member for East Hampshire for bringing this debate. I'm aware till the last election he was my aunt's MP, so I always get a lesser when I speak in debates with him. First of all, I'm thinking about this debate less about rural housing targets, more about rural homes. Having grown up in as he's indicated, largest constituency in England, and being privileged now to serve as the MP for it, it regularly hits me that I walk down the street, I go to my surgeries, I'm far more likely to bump into my mates' grandparents or their parents than I am to bump into them doing the job. They've had to move out, whether that's to Newcastle, whether that's down south, whether that's out to Manchester. And it's one of the great sadnesses of the job, frankly, that you do not see communities thriving as much as they could have done because they are having young people forced to leave communities that need them, frankly. And at the moment, I am frequently contacted by parents from across West Northumberland. Northumberland County Council are trying to force some of our smaller schools to a 2-form entry rather than a 3-form entry. Rural depopulation is a major concern. It's something that I think transcends party politics, and I do hope that we can have a genuinely grown-up conversation about how we do better policy making for rural areas to support those communities. And ultimately, when I go out into the North Tyne, where I live at the moment, or where I go into central town of Hexham or Prado, I'm often asked about specific developments and my views on them. And I genuinely always try and approach these things of, we need to make sure that there are places for people to grow up, for businesses to invest in their employees. I spoke to one medium-sized employer in Hexham who spent a lot of time training their apprentices, who then can't afford to live in Hexham, move to Blythe, to the coast, move to a rival firm, who therefore get all the benefit of that employee's wisdom and experience and the investment they put into them, but none of the cost. I think that is when we're looking at how we generate the vibrancy that we really need in our rural economies, something that we absolutely need. I do have a slight issue with the definition of rurality in a few documents. I mean, I was drawing up this speech. Rurality is often defined as settlements below 10,000 people. Prodo is 10,288. Hexham is 10,941 at the last figures. You would not walk down the street and think of either of them as urban. And having just received news today of bank branch closures in my constituency, it was incredibly disappointing to see that the bank branches were considered urban, despite, you know, the kind of common sense test of walking out, seeing the Tyne Valley in all its beauty, and being able to see right down into the North Tyne from Hexham. They are not urban communities. They are bigger than Barrisford, bigger than Wark, bigger than Humshoff, bigger than plenty of other communities, but they are not urban. And improving the infrastructure must come with those must come with any great advances in housing, in-house building and housing targets. It must come with the improvements to, in my case, I hope to see the Tyne Valley line, which requires much needed investment. I think if I could get the Tyne Valley line improved, as my staff said to me, they'd build a statue of me in certain villages in my constituency. I don't hope for that. I'm not lobbying for that. The County Council will probably have enough against me before I start lobbying for monuments. But we do need to make sure that those infrastructures run on time. I also want to make sure that I get on the record that the limit in housing is something that really is driving the social housing waiting list crisis. It's one of the main drivers in my inbox of work for my caseworkers, and one of the things that comes across my desk at surgeries most often is the SEND crisis and the crisis in social housing in rural areas. People in Northumberland being rehomed from, don't expect any honourable members in here to have a huge working knowledge of the diverseness of Northumberland, but Ashington to Allendale is an extreme, I'm glad to see he recognised that. It's an extreme difference, and yeah, there's real provision in a lack of affordable and social housing that means that those who want to remain within the same county are forced to move to radically different communities that are often simply not suited for their needs. I'd also very quickly like to place on record my thanks to Kim McGuinness, Mayor of the North East and a great friend of mine, who's really prioritised the housing crisis on her agenda, and I know that she is considerably aware, largely because I won't shut up about it, about the rural housing crisis, about the fact that drives so many of the tragic bits of casework that come through our door, or the deeply concerning bits of casework that comes through our door. When the government comes to look at rural house building, we do need to consider how we build communities and homes rather than simply building empty houses and empty buildings. And I am absolutely in support of making sure that, you know, the sixth form at QEHS now, where I was privileged to attend and where I'm going to visit this Friday, they are able to get the jobs that they want to remain locally with the broadband connectivity that brings, with the transport connectivity that they need, and to make their homes and their lives in the North East should they wish to.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. William. I can't say on a personal level, it's a particular pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. We go back a very long way, do we not? And I want to congratulate the Right Honourable Gentleman on bringing forward this debate. And that, in a way, leads me to my first difficulty, which, of course, housing is devolved. But, Ms Jardine, you will understand that when constituents come to you as a Scottish member, you're duty-bound to raise them. I want to start with two very brief anecdotes. I was canvassing in Ullapool in Wester Ross before the election, and I was really astounded to be told by a householder that the local head teacher had to commute from well to the east of my vast constituency every day there and back because there was no housing available in Ullapool, which seemed absolutely ludicrous, because if anyone should be part of a local community, one would hope that the head teacher was. That struck me mightily, that particular fact. And then after the election, I was staying with my wife in the Summer Isles Hotel in Achilty-Buie, and that's getting pretty remote. And I was talking to the young barman behind the bar, and we knew that the hotel was going to be closed over winter. And I said, so what will you do during the winter time? And you know what's coming. Mr. Jardine, he said, I have to head south. I can't, there's nowhere for me to stay here. I can't afford the accommodation. And the Honourable Member for Hexham has rightly made mention of depopulation. And depopulation has been the utter curse of the Highlands for generations. And it's one of the great tragedies. If you drive across Caithness and what we call the Causeway Mire, pronounced locally Casey Mire, you'll see umpteen empty wee houses either side in the heather. That's people who've gone and gone forever. And that is the tragedy of the Highlands. So people leaving because they can't get accommodation in Achterbury is a desperate business altogether. But I just wanted to say on the record that in no way do I blame the Highland Council for this problem. They do their level best as a local authority against the odds to think of imaginative ways of creating housing. But if a wee house comes on the market in Wester Ross or in most of my constituency, it's snapped up by people from far away who can afford the prices which other people, local people, simply cannot. So I want to turn to really what happens in my constituency office. In the Highlands, we have about 8,000 people on the waiting list for housing. And my office would get every week 2, 3, 4, 5 housing cases, which are incredibly hard to resolve. And if you talk about them going private, renting or buying, as I've already hinted, they're just priced out of the market. And when you balance this fact with something which I am grateful to the previous government for, which I will put on the record, is that we were given the Cromarty Firth Green Freeport, one of 2 in Scotland, which was a real shot in the arm and will be similarly under the new government for the area. It could make as big a contribution as Dounreay came when it through Caithness, nuclear power came in, or when the Nig or Kishon oil fabrication yards came to Ross and Cromarty. These are things that really offer employment to keep people there. But the point is very simple. If we don't have the housing, then what are we going to do? Despite the best intentions of the previous government and the best intentions of this government, without the housing, it really gets in the way of it. It really, really gets in the way of it. I'm going to conclude my remarks with that, except to say that I find it personally very difficult to see young people put in this position, and it is really quite harrowing. And it seems to me to be a sort of fundamental injustice, that it's wrong that they have to face these terrible, terrible decisions. Do I stay where I come from? But I can't, so I have to go away. I can remember my own father, before the oil came, the North Sea oil came, saying to me in my own lifetime, you'll have to go south. You'll have to go south, young man. Well, that is something we don't want to see happen. So I'm talking about a devolved matter, Ms. Jardine, but can I simply say this? I have great faith in the best intentions of governments of all colour. As and when the best practice is developed to tackle this problem, I simply ask that His Majesty's government would share best practice with the Scottish government so that we can see how we can nip this problem and try and reverse this wretched tendency. I hope now, as I speak, that the teacher has got a house in Ullapool, but I'm not sure that she has. I'll leave it with that, Ms. Jardine. Thank you very much indeed.
Dr. Peter Prinsley, please.
Thank you, Ms. Jardine, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. So I'm an MP from rural Suffolk, and I hope we can create affordable rural housing. And I ask, why did our predecessors not try and do this? I believe that there are changes to the rural exception regulations that could help achieve this at an appropriate scale, so that we retain the character of our towns and villages. We need to help build housing, but crucially, we need to help build local communities. Housing for young families, but also housing for older people, perhaps with embedded building features such as walls that are sufficiently strong to hold grab rails. I was told by Age UK only this morning that in Japan, stamp duty is waived if the children of older people buy houses near to where their elderly parents live. Too many of our villages in Suffolk and in Norfolk, where I live, are occupied by ageing residents, far from family and services. and I'm sure we can make changes to improve things whilst repopulating the rural community and building resilience for the future. So let's rebuild our rural communities at a scale sympathetic to the existing settlements. Thank you.
Kibati, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve your chairmanship. And can I thank my right honourable friend for East Hampshire for securing this debate. And in many ways, I was hanging off his every word because I genuinely felt he was speaking to the concerns of my constituents as well on a whole number of issues. And look, let me start with how he started and how other members have started as well, which is we all want housing. We recognise the need for housing. And in my constituency of Meriden and Solihull East, I have a constituency of two halves, a very urban north and a very rural south. So in many ways, many of the issues we discussed in this house affect me in both ways. And where we, in fact, all of the speakers have referred to young families and young people, and the honourable member, my honourable friend, spoke about affordable housing. I actually agree with him. And one of the conversations I've been having with my local council is about starter homes. So young families who want to grow up and grow their families in a place where they are connected to is clearly of vital importance, and we've heard about that. But I would say to the Minister, it's clear to me that the formula, as my right honourable friend pointed out, really does impact rural areas in a much more detrimental way. And I actually believe, I'd like the Minister to achieve his targets actually, but I do think that this formula does not allow that to happen. And I actually have form on this because when we tried to do it when we were in government, I raised a similar issue because I thought the formula was disproportionately affecting my constituency as opposed to what's happening in Birmingham, which is next to us, and in other areas such as Walsall, where I was born and brought up. And in fact, I remember having the conversation in number 10 on a number of occasions. I was very pleased that the formula was re-looked at because the current formula, for example, requires Solihull, which currently builds about 866 homes per year. That increases to 1,317, whereas in Birmingham, the current plan has about 7,174 homes, and the revised plans would take it down to 4,974. It's a huge disparity in housing, and I'm sure the Minister would agree with me. I believe him to be a reasonable person, that he would agree with me that actually in Birmingham there are people who will require housing, and so that reduction in numbers does not make sense whatsoever. It is quite a significant plummet. Look, I campaign on protecting my green belt, and I really do feel that. But there is, I feel particularly uniquely affected, and my constituents do, for two reasons. First of all, we have the Meriden Gap, which is a throughway for wildlife, who migrate every year through the Meriden Gap, and it is of vital importance. It is what is known as the West Midlands lungs, and it's actually the lungs for the whole of the United Kingdom. So one of the questions, I'm conscious of time, one of the questions I'll just pose to the Minister, because as a new MPPF comes forward, will the Minister or the government take into account areas of vital importance like the Meriden Gap? And my right honourable friend obviously mentioned National Park. What I don't want to see is, because of that, actually the burden on the council is increased because other parts of the green belt have to be affected because through no fault of their own they have areas of really importance to the nature. But the other part of the I wanted to raise is my constituency is specifically affected by HS2. We have a station just by the NEC in Birmingham Airport. Walsall Common has had to take a huge amount of load. It's been ripped open many times over, and it's also taking on additional housing, significant amounts already in the thousands. And Hampton and Arden, a beautiful part of my constituency, is now starting to see the effects of HS2. This is critical national infrastructure, and surely the sacrifice that my constituents are making in terms of their green belt, that should be taken into account. Currently, I don't see anything in relation to that. And that's the same challenge, by the way, I posed to the previous government. And I stand by that challenge. So really, and I'm conscious of time, I just wanted to pose those questions to the Minister. And I hope I'm more than happy for him to come and visit my constituency. I will happily show him around in a spirit of cross-party working where he can deliver some good news to my constituents.
Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, a real pleasure to serve under your chairship. I did it last week, did it this week as well, so we're on a roll now, you know. Can I say what a pleasure it is to hear the Honourable Gentleman for East Hampshire setting the scene. He very clearly set the scene for his own constituency, and since the title of the subject matter is Housing Targets in Rural Areas, I set the scene for my constituency of Strangford. And like the Honourable Gentleman,
that's not on the leader rules.
That's what I want to refer to. He referred to it as a devolved matter. It's a devolved matter for Northern Ireland as well, but I think it's important that we come along to make our contributions to this debate and wholeheartedly support the theme that the Honourable Gentleman for East Hampshire put forward. I represent a constituency of Strangford. It's a very rural area. The issue of housing in rural areas comes up all the time, and I'll explain that if I can through this debate. There's been numerous calls for better housing provision, and that's what I want to perhaps, and not just better housing provision, but also a better level of housing provision. In other words, up to the standards of the days that people wish to have. So when I listen to the opening members' comments wholeheartedly and echo what they have said surrounding housing provision in his constituency in particular, from private housing to social housing provision, there are real challenges in the number of properties available. This is something I and my staff witness daily in the office. We have countless, and I use that word on purpose to describe it, countless ongoing social housing cases where people are needed to be rehomed in rural areas for different reasons. And the stock merely isn't there, Madam Chair. And that's the issue which all of the honourable members have tried to illustrate. Only last month back home, the Communities Minister announced the launch of the Housing Supply Strategy 24-39. That's a good 16 years, which provides a 15-year framework in particular for the development and delivery of policies and actions needed to deliver our housing supply needs. There are a series of challenges that must be addressed, which will require a collaborative approach from all stages of government. So, again, I want to sow into the debate, Madam Chair, what we're doing in Northern Ireland to hopefully help support the Honourable Member for East Hampshire, but also to help the Minister. The Minister is always very constructive when he comes back with his answers to all our questions. And we appreciate that very much, and I look forward to that contribution later. Furthermore, Madam Chair, the Northern Ireland housing executive is of major importance when it comes to the housing stock, especially in rural areas. The housing executive has also released a rural strategy specifically for Northern Ireland. Evidence from the 2016-2020 draft rural strategy highlighted successes within the rural housing sector in Northern Ireland. For example, the housing executive invested a total of approximately £204.13 million in rural communities, where just under 18% of that was for housing stock that's been allocated. Work commenced on 425 new build social homes in rural areas, helping to address social housing needs and to support the growth of these communities. So there is a strategy, there's a policy and a way forward, and approximately £82.4 million was invested in the maintenance and improvement of our rural housing stock. That work, Madam Chair, highlights the importance of funding into our rural areas, and they are so important, a massive part of the housing sector. But I understand there's still a long way to go. My social housing lists in my office and two offices that I have in the constituency, one in Ballinhinch, one in Newtownards, illustrate that figuratively and statistically as well. As of June 2030, over 45,000 individuals were on the housing executive's waiting list, with more than 32,000 classified as being in housing stress, indicating an urgent need for accommodation. This is not solely the responsibility of the housing executive, Madam Chair, as we often say that the money we get to fund into our departments and sectors come from government centrally here through the block grant. And there is, I believe, more to be done to take the immense pressure off families in terms of making housing more affordable, accessible and safe. The housing backlog comes from an increase in property prices, and some of the greatest rises of houses and prices in all of the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland has been Northern Ireland. The standard monthly rental price is between £600 and £700 per month, far above the breadline. I conclude with this, Madam Chair, for I'm conscious of the time. More needs to be done to preserve and maintain housing stock. Housing prices are hitting the record high. So I look to the Minister for direction on his plans to help support the devolved institutions as much as he can. And whilst it's always understood that these issues are devolved, there is, I believe, a moral responsibility to ensure that no family is left behind and that our executive has the support it needs by this government centrally right here. Thanks very much.
Greg Smith.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve as your chairman. Congratulate and thank my right honourable friend for securing this important debate. I fundamentally want to talk about fairness. Fairness was something that the Labour Party used to use a lot to try and define themselves. But I would put it to this House, and particularly to the Minister, who I have exchanged regularly on this subject, not least that we both sat on the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill Committee back in 2022. Many people remember 2022 politics for other reasons. We remember it for 9 months of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill Committee. When you look at the differential between what rural communities like that, which I am lucky enough to represent in mid-Buckinghamshire, are being asked to build, compared to our towns and cities, that fairness just isn't there. If we look at the example of Buckinghamshire as a county, we were already starting from a pretty punchy base. We were already starting from a point of an expectation to build some 61,000 new homes over the coming decades. The new ask of Buckinghamshire under this new government, from a starting base, looked like it was going to be 91,000. That's a 42% increase, plus this mystical 5% deliverability addition to that. And then the latest published number is a whopping 95,000 new homes expected over the next couple of decades. With that extra 5% added on, that's nearly a 50% increase. And that's not including the new town proposals that may well come through, those new towns of up to 10 or over 10,000 new properties. Buckinghamshire could well be looking at yet another Milton Keynes. And I would gently put it to the Minister that Buckinghamshire has actually already taken its hit on building a new town. It's now a 250,000 population city that is, of course, Milton Keynes, that did take away a huge chunk of rural Buckinghamshire. Buckinghamshire Council has always been very reasonable in what it has put forward as proposals. We have actually built tens of thousands of new homes in my constituency alone since the start of the century. If you look at villages like Hadnam, it is unrecognisable as a village, the level of development, and the developers keep piling in. There are more controversial proposals on agricultural land, on farmland, being considered right now just in that one village of Hadnam, and it comes up on door after door after door, where people are fed up with the loss of farmland, the loss of our rural identity, and making our countryside more urban. And the reason I want to talk about fairness is when you compare and contrast what Buckinghamshire is being asked to do, and you look at what the Mayor of London is being asked to do. Of course, the Mayor of London is being let off by 20% on his housing targets. London, our great capital city, where there are oodles of brownfield sites crying out for regeneration, homes where people are crying out to be able to buy them, starter homes through to family homes and everything in between. Why is London, Labour London, being let off those housing numbers when our rural communities in Buckinghamshire are being asked to take the pain? And when I expand that argument on fairness, I think it is a reasonable expectation that development from housing needs to be seen, as my honourable friend from Meriden has also said, relevant to his constituency, side by side with those other asks that are taking away our landscape, that are taking away our nature, that are taking away our agricultural land, which of course is a challenge on food security, and that is those additional asks on top of housing, of the countless solar industrial installations that my constituency is seeing, from Rosefield in the Claydons through to Kimberwick and many others. The battery storage facilities that we are seeing proposed, again in the Claydons, another one popping up in recent weeks near Little Missenden in the south of my constituency. And of course, like my honourable friend from Meriden, the great destroyer HS2, which has devastated mile upon mile upon mile of the Buckinghamshire countryside for no benefit to my constituents whatsoever. So I would ask the Minister to reflect on that point of fairness, to ask him to look, when he considers these housing targets on rural communities, to consider those other projects that are going on, many state-sponsored like HS2, that have that impact on these rural communities. And the last point I will make before I wind up is that many services can't cope for the residents that we already have, be that GPs, be that hospital services. Take the Chiltern line, for example, where again, from Hadnam and Tame Parkway Station, regularly in rush hour now, such is the population growth, people are being left behind on the platform. That is not Chiltern Railway's fault. That is the sheer growth in demand without anything to make up for it. So I ask the Minister to reflect on fairness, to ask on the multiple demands on our rural communities, and ask him to think again about that balance between rural and urban.
Andrew George.
Thank you, Jardine, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the right honourable member for East Hampshire for having secured this very important debate. And it's interesting to follow the honourable member for mid Buckinghamshire, a different environment, a different set of conditions. And interesting that he's presented it as a question of fairness, in the sense that house building is an imposition rather than an opportunity for local communities. And I'll come on to why I say that. I mean, planning should fundamentally be about meeting need, not about greed. But too often it's driven by greed rather than need, and that kind of underlies the wrong dynamic, which is creating a lot of the ill feeling towards the kind of development that the member for Mid Buckinghamshire and indeed others have described. There is, I think, a false dichotomy created by the Prime Minister in saying that he's putting he's backing builders and not blockers, because, as I say, it's a false dichotomy, and my fear is that it's putting greed before need, but in proxy, if it's handled wrongly. I mean, the fundamental, if you like, failing of decades of setting housing targets in the ways that successive governments have is that it's both wrongly conceived, and it's also based on a naive delusion. It's a naive delusion that private developers would be willing to collude with the government in driving down the price of their completed product. It's a naive delusion, which I'm afraid you find adherents in all political parties have adopted this view for decades, that they believe that actually if we build enough, the price will come down, and the developers will cooperate with us in doing that, and that has simply not happened. The fundamental problem with setting house building targets is that house building is a means to an end. The end is meeting housing need. So if the targets were to reduce housing need, and planning applicants had to demonstrate how their developments were going to address that need and to reduce the need on an annual basis, rather than simply building to meet, if you like, their commercial advantage. And in places like Cornwall, what they do is they build to meet property investors' requirements and second homeowners and holiday lets, that we don't actually get the kind of developments that actually are there to meet local housing need. And that's why house building targets, which is a means to an end, not the end, because we kind of see that as a proxy for what we're trying to fundamentally achieve. That's why it's both ill-conceived and a naive delusion. I mean, Cornwall indeed is one of the best examples of where this policy has fundamentally failed, because Cornwall is almost trebled in size. It's one of the fastest. It's like Buckinghamshire. It's one of the proportionately. It's one of the fastest growing places in the United Kingdom. It's almost trebled its housing stock, as I say, in the last 60 years, and yet the housing problems of local people have got worse. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't build houses and therefore will meet need. I'm simply saying that by setting house building targets, it's actually created an environment in which the wrong type of housing has been developed. Okay? And so, I mean, I have to declare an interest because I during my 9-year sabbatical away from this place, I was the chief executive of a registered provider, a housing association, and therefore worked in this sector and therefore know how the dynamics of the system works and know how one battles with landowners who have massive hope value, an expectation that they can get 100 times agricultural land value on the edge of their town and village if they can get away with it. And that's just human nature. It would apply to any of us, okay? So the fact that when Nicholas Ridley, as the Environment Secretary back in the early 90s, introduced the Rural Exceptions Policy, which was the first break from adopting planning policy which is based purely on use rather than considering user, and introduced that policy which said, but if it meets a local housing need in perpetuity, we will, as an exception, allow development which meets that local need. And the Honourable Member for Bury St Edmunds mentioned that this policy needs to be expanded, and indeed it should be, and indeed in Cornwall, where the policy is well founded in Cornwall, much of the affordable housing development actually is delivered through rural exception sites. So it's quite a powerful policy. Yes, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the honourable member, and it's fascinating to hear him talking about rural exception sites and their success in Cornwall. Yet elsewhere, only 14 of 91 local planning authorities that have a policy of using rural exception sites have actually built houses using this policy. Why does he think that discrepancy exists?
Well, it is...
Remind the honourable member that we have less than 2 minutes left before we have to move on to the front bench.
I do beg your pardon, Ms Jardine. I got to run away with myself. And as far as my honourable friend is concerned, there are a whole range of reasons why it is extremely difficult to deliver on rural exception sites. I mean, one of the difficulties, which I've expressed to the Minister, is that housing associations are required to achieve viability thresholds, which are quite difficult to reach, particularly if they're based on a cost-to-value ratio, and if the value of properties in a particular location are low. Actually, absurdly, you get into a situation where under that formula they're not able to proceed under the rules under which they operate. I simply want to say, in finishing, just to rattle through, that there are counterproductive consequences as a result of this, because of the hope value that is created. The bigger the targets, the bigger the hope value on the edges of communities. Although it sounds counterintuitive, the best way of building and meeting housing need in rural areas is to draw the development boundary tight and not allow development around that, but to have a very strong rural exceptions policy, and to also build into that the ability to deliver an intermediate market. And by intermediate market, I mean a part sale or indeed discounted sale homes which are available in perpetuity for all subsequent local occupants who meet a local first-time buyer requirement. And we do need to, in rural areas, control second homes and also address all of the other issues relating to affordable housing need. I apologise, Ms.
Thank you. That's okay. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Charlotte Kane, please.
Thank you, Ms Jardine. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and congratulations to the Right Honourable Member for East Hampshire for bringing this debate. I refer members to my register of interests as a district councillor. Everyone deserves a decent home, and they should be able to find that home near family, friends and work. But in rural areas, Our young adults don't have these opportunities. CPRE has reported that in the 5 years to March 2023, rural homelessness has increased by 40%. And I know from my work as a district councillor and indeed my MP casework that much of the existing rural housing suffers from damp, is poorly insulated and relies on oil or bottled gas for heating. Liberal Democrats know that development can bring benefits to rural communities, but only if those communities are fully involved in the decisions about that development. We welcome the priority given to housing. As well as building more houses, we must ensure that they're high-quality homes. The Conservatives let developers get away with building to poor standards and without the GPs, schools, community infrastructure that was so badly needed, especially in the rural areas. They also let them off the hook for leaving land for housing unbuilt and new homes empty. Liberal Democrats would build 150,000 new social homes to tackle the housing shortage crisis and give renters a fair deal by immediately banning no-fault evictions and creating a national register of licensed landlords. And we welcome those measures in the Renters' Rights Bill. We want housing development which is community-led by integrating infrastructure and public services into the planning process. With proper community engagement, local amenities like GPs, schools and public transport will be built alongside the new homes. We believe that local authorities should have greater powers to build their own homes and hold developers to account. The local authorities are best placed to know what developments are needed in their area, not central government. In my constituency of Ely and East Cambridgeshire, Bottisham Parish Council have been exemplary in working with developers to identify sites to deliver affordable housing and maintain a strong sense of a village community. Land for housing is in limited supply, yet land with planning permission is often banked by developers. The government must unblock the thousands of permitted homes which are not being built, and allow councils to buy land at current use value rather than an inflated hoped-for value, so that more social and affordable homes can be built. And none of this housing should come at the expense of our environment. The government must deliver house building and protect our environment. South Cambs District Council has an excellent record on this, with Camborne and Trumpington Meadows in Cambridge both delivering housing and open space for wildlife and recreation in partnership with the local Wildlife Trust. And in my constituency, the development of ongoing in Waterbeach also has green space at its core. For the planning process to be run effectively, our local authorities need strong planning departments, and that takes money. As well as government providing more funding, local authorities should be able to set their own fees so they have the capacity to consult appropriately and assess each case fully and promptly. Finally, houses don't build themselves. We don't have enough qualified construction workers. FE colleges need sufficient long-term funding to set up the courses to train these workers. We need to look at the qualifications required to teach these courses. Some older, experienced construction workers are not eligible to teach because they have older qualifications. We need to review whether their existing qualifications and experience are sufficient, or whether they can be fast-tracked to achieve the new qualifications so they can teach the next cohort of bricklayers, plumbers and other construction workers. I will give way.
Can I commend on everybody? It's brought up a really, really important point, Madam Chair, and that's in relation to apprenticeships. I know in my constituency where there's a tradition of service in the construction sector, there's a shortage, and the shortage happens because there's better pay for those outside of the construction sector. And does anybody feel that maybe if there's going to be a change in maybe a 3-year apprenticeship, for an example, there needs to be a better pay structure as well to incentivise people to actually go towards the construction sector?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and I agree we need to look at the salaries for the trainers as well. We stand ready to support the government to get more houses built, including in rural areas, but the planning reforms must work with local communities, not cut them out of the process. Local authorities must be resourced and empowered to ensure developers build the houses, ensure adequate GPs, schools, shops and other infrastructure, with green space for people and nature at the heart of all developments. And we must ensure that most of these houses are the social and truly affordable homes which so many people in rural areas desperately need. Thank you, Chair.
Opposition spokesman Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Mrs Jardine, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today and to respond to this debate submitted by my right honourable friend and close constituency neighbour, the right honourable gentleman for East Hampshire. Can I congratulate him, Mrs Jardine? He is my former boss when I was his special advisor, and as you can tell from his speech this afternoon, I was never allowed to write them because he was so brilliant at orating within the chamber. But I know that he is a doughty champion for his constituents in East Hampshire, and I congratulate him on securing this debate. In December 2024, the Government published its reforms to the National Planning Policy Framework, which included the reintroduction of mandatory house building targets. As of March 2025, some local authorities will face an overwhelming five-fold increase in new housing targets dictated by central government. These targets will hit many rural areas, as my right honourable friend outlined, councils hardest, and they are to be imposed with little regard for local people. We firmly believe that building more homes is a necessity. For too long, the dream of home ownership, as my right honourable friend and members across this House have said, for too long, the dream of home ownership has felt out of reach for many hard-working families. And we must make this dream a reality for as many people as possible. A property-owning democracy and people having a house in different areas is vital to giving maturing and succeeding generations a stake in the society in which they live. Now, while I'm supportive of the Government's ambitious goal to build 1.5 million new homes, I must stress that these homes must be the right homes built in the right places and by a method that ensures the voices of local communities are listened to. And the troubling reality is that the Government's housing targets are frankly unrealistic, and they know it. The Chief Executive of Homes England has cast doubts on whether the Government can realistically meet its goal of building those homes. And the Housing Minister himself, in a Select Committee hearing last year, has said that it will be hard for them and virtually nearly not achievable for them to build the 1.5 million homes in the lifetime of this Parliament. And a recent CCN survey found that 9 in 10 councils cited a lack of infrastructure as the main reason they could not support the new targets, with the delivery of new schools, doctors' surgeries and other social infrastructure lagging behind the delivery of housing. But it is not just unrealistic and unpopular targets. It is also the fact that the methodology seemed to represent a cynical gerrymandering exercise of political opportunism. For example, take East Hampshire, the New Forest and Fareham. These areas are being told to build more houses than Manchester, with the New Forest and North East Hampshire having national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. But meanwhile, cities like Labour-run Southampton, Nottingham and Coventry see their targets slashed by as much as 50%. It doesn't add up. The Government's new method punishes opposition councils for their success and rewards Labour local authorities for failure. Why has the Government reduced housing targets in urban areas where it is easier to build due to existing infrastructure and population density and the availability of brownfield sites? But instead, Labour reforms to the NPPF have resulted in top-down targets that will silence local voices. They've chosen to prioritise building in rural areas and on the green belt, rather than focusing on where the demand for housing is greatest, in our cities and in our urban centres. Under the Government's proposal set out in the NPPF, councils in county areas will have to deliver at least an extra 64,769 homes per year, equating to 1,240 homes per week. This is 7 times higher than the targets for large towns and cities governed by metropolitan authorities. This rewards cities like Labour-run Southampton City Council, which is consistently under-delivered on its targets, having been required to deliver 1,473 houses in the 23-24 period. They built a mere 261. In response, the Government has opted to ensure that they are spared further humiliation for failure by having their target cut by 12%. This is a similar story across the country. In some rural areas, housing targets will increase by 113%, while in urban settings the increase will be a mere 1%. If indeed there is an increase at all, how does this make sense? Now, the Minister will know that I'm no fan of Liberal Democrat-run Eastleigh Borough Council because they are building double the number required because of their failure, because of their excessive borrowing and their failure to run a decent council. But his policies are unfair to councils like that too, which is facing Eastleigh is facing a 42% increase in its house building requirement from 645 houses a year to 922. But they have consistently over-delivered on their housing targets over the last 5 years. So where is the retrospectivity that should be delivered to successful councils that have over-delivered on their promises and their housing targets over the last period? We're seeing this. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Did I just hear the Honourable Member describe his local Liberal Democrat council as successful?
No, I think he's grasping at straws there. I think the Liberal Democrat-run administration in Eastleigh is anything but successful. If you look at value for money and the £750 million worth of debt that his leader has accrued on the people of Eastleigh. But if you look at his method of paying that debt off, which is to build beyond the targets at which they were expected to do while destroying green areas in my constituency, he will see that it is still not fair that his council and my local council are being asked to deliver more homes despite the fact that they've delivered more than was required. That's my point, and my point is that there needs to be retrospectivity to councils that have delivered on those conditions. And it's the same issue in East Hampshire, which, as my honourable friend noted, will see their target rise by 98%, from 575 to 1,142. And in Fareham, which also takes in half of my constituency, they will take a 62% rise from 498 to 800 houses. I must ask the Minister, why are councils which have built more than their required share of housing being punished for their success, whereas their political allies, and generally Labour councils, have had the pressure taken off of them despite their continued failures to deliver? And it is beyond belief that in rural areas, which are already struggling with infrastructure and a fragile environment, they're being handed these inflated housing targets, while urban areas with a far greater demand for housing see their targets reduced. That is not just poor planning, it's unfair. Protecting the green belt and preserving our natural environment are non-negotiable. And yet, under these new policies, we're seeing parts of the green belt reclassified as grey belt land for development, as my honourable friend, the member for not Milton Keynes, he didn't want to be Milton Keynes, for mid-Buckinghamshire. And we cannot allow unsustainable urban sprawl to destroy what we have so worked hard to preserve, including national parks, as my right honourable friend and honourable friend outlined. Further, one of the most disheartening aspects of this debate is the way the government has cut key programmes like Right to Buy, first-time buyer stamp duty relief, while simultaneously reducing affordable homes for purchase. That's not the way to help people onto the property ladder. It's not the way to address the housing crisis, and it certainly shouldn't come at the cost of rural England. And Labour MPs agree. Indeed, 14 Labour front benchers have campaigned against house building in their own constituencies, a contradiction of the Prime Minister's pledge to have a government of builders, not blockers. If Labour can't even get their own party to back their housing targets, how can they expect their Labour council leaders to do so either? In contrast, I'm running out of time, but I'll take one brief intervention.
One of the first visits I had as a new constituent MP was to Allendale Parish Council, one of the most rural areas of my constituency. They were telling me that they recognise the need for housing. So I think it's rather cynical to say that it would be the death of rural England to build more houses.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right in that he should have devolution, and the government's brought that forward. He's Labour leader, may want to build more houses, but what I'm saying is that the government's algorithm is making it easier to build huge numbers of houses in rural England where that infrastructure is harder to deliver, while generally Labour councils and urban centres are having their targets cut. And the Minister shakes his head, but I've just outlined the figures that show that that is the case, including London, as my honourable friend mentioned. And he really does need to go back and re-look at this algorithm, as was the ask by colleagues on this side of the House. In conclusion, many will be pleased to know the road ahead is challenging, but it is not insurmountable. We can build the homes we need if we listen to the communities, respect local voices and commit to sustainable development. The government should rethink their house building algorithm to depoliticise this policy and do and to local authorities the courtesy of not punishing their hard work by meeting previous targets. I stand with him, ready to come up with an algorithm that works for rural and urban areas. If he takes that up, the Conservative Party will be very committed to helping deliver the 1.5 million homes that he has outlined. But let us work together to ensure that the dream of home ownership remains within reach for everyone, and that we do so in a way that respects our environment, our countryside and our way of life. Thank you.
Before I call the Minister, could I just ask him to ensure that we have 2 minutes at the end for the right honourable member to wind up. Minister Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Ms Jardine. I note your stricture on the 2 minutes at the end, and it's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. Let me begin by congratulating the right honourable gentleman, the member for East Hampshire, on securing this important debate today. I also thank him for so clearly articulating his concerns about the implications of housing targets for his constituency. As you might expect, I take issue with a number of the arguments he made for the reasons I'll come to, but no one can be in any doubt as to his commitment to forcefully representing the views of those he represents. I also thank the Shadow Minister and other honourable members for their contributions in what has been a thoughtful and well-informed debate. Ms Jardine, I must make clear at the outset that I'm unable to comment on individual local plans or local planning applications, or for that matter, how individual local planning authorities may interpret national planning policy due to the quasi-judicial nature of the planning process and the potential decision-making role of the Deputy Prime Minister. I can and will, however, make general comments as they relate to the various matters raised, and I'll touch on each of the 3 specific points the right honourable gentleman raised in his opening speech. Ms Jardine, I don't think anyone in this room, and we've heard several arguments to that effect this afternoon, would dispute that England is in the grip of an acute and entrenched housing crisis. That crisis is blighting lives, not just those at the sharp end of the crisis in temporary accommodation, but the many, many families out there desperate to buy a first home of their own. And it's also hampering economic growth and productivity and consuming ever larger amounts of public money in the form of a rapidly rising housing benefit bill. Now, the crisis has many causes, but among the most important is a failure over many decades to build enough homes of all tenures to meet housing demand and housing need in both rural and urban areas. And the government is absolutely determined to tackle it head on, which is why our plan for change commits us to an ambitious and stretching, and I've never been anything other than candid about the fact that it is incredibly stretching, milestone of building 1.5 million new homes in this Parliament. But what I gently say to the Shadow Minister is that it's not enough to will the ends, you have to will the means as well. And that is why we have instituted the various reforms we have done today, and why more are in planning. Planning reform, Ms Jardine, is integral to meeting that manifesto commitment, which is why we've already overhauled the National Planning Policy Framework to reverse the anti-supply changes made by the previous government in December 2023, and to introduce a range of measures that will enable us to build the homes and infrastructure the country needs. Now, Ms Jardine, we believe in a plan-led system. It is through local development plans that communities shape decisions about how to deliver the housing and wider development their area needs, and those plans must remain the cornerstone of our planning system. But we are clear that local decisions must be about how to meet housing need, not whether to do so at all. That's why we've restored mandatory housing targets, as the manifesto on which we stood and won a decisive victory last July committed us to doing. This means that local authorities must use the standard method as the basis for determining housing requirements in their local plans. However, we made clear that a mandatory method is insufficient if the method itself is not adequate to meet housing need. That's why our revised MPBF implements a new standard method for assessing housing needs that aligns with our ambitions for 1.5 million new homes in this Parliament. We do think that new standard method strikes the right balance, and indeed we adjusted it from the proposals we consulted on last July in response to significant feedback from experts, from developers, from local authorities across the country, much of which pressed us on the fact that the formula we consulted on was not sufficiently responsive to affordability demands. And so we've adjusted that method in the revised MPBF we published on the 12th of December. The new method, Ms Jardine, we think better responds to affordability pressures by using a higher affordability adjustment in its calculation. This recognised the importance of housing affordability in assessing housing needs and helps direct more homes to where they are needed and least affordable. And it also provides greater certainty to the sector through more stable and predictable housing numbers, compared to the previous approach that relied, as the Shadow Minister will know, on out-of-date demographic projections and unevidenced and arbitrary adjustments. Now, the right honourable gentleman raised a specific concern about how that standard method translates into local plan making. While local authorities are expected to use the standard method to assess housing needs, they are able to justify a lower housing requirement than the figure the method sets on the basis of local constraints on land availability, on constraints on development and other relevant matters such as national landscapes, protected habitats and flood risk areas. Local authorities would need to consider these matters, obviously, as they prepare their plans. I'll give way very briefly. But we do expect them to explore all options to deliver the homes their communities need. And that means, Ms Jardine, maximising brownfield land, densifying brownfield sites that are available, working with neighbouring authorities on cross-boundary housing growth, and, where necessary, reviewing the Greenbelt. I'm happy to give way.
I'm very grateful. Would he accept, though, recognise that point about local councils don't want to end up in legal proceedings, which can cost an awful lot of money, and there's an awful lot of weight placed on knowing that the plan is sound, and the risk that you take by deviating from the standard method. Yes, it's true the guidance says you can deviate as long as you can prove. Well, I'm genuinely not quite sure what it says, so long as you can prove X. But whatever it is, it's not totally clear to people, and it leaves a great deal of nervousness that deviation would leave councils exposed to potentially very high costs, ultimately, of course, borne by local people. And could he look at clarifying that advice on how one can deviate from the method?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that intervention. I will reflect on the concerns he raises to the clarity of the guidance, but local planning authorities can and do prepare, develop, submit local plans, arguing that those constraints exist and therefore their housing requirement should be lower than the standard method applies, and they are expected to evidence and justify that approach to planning through housing in their local plan consultation, and ultimately that will be scrutinised plan examination by a planning inspector as to whether those constraints are justified in terms of whether the plan is sound. The right honourable gentleman and others have mentioned the balance between rural and urban housing targets. Now, we recognise that the targets we've introduced are ambitious. They do mean uplifts in many areas. However, we believe the significant and entrenched nature of the housing crisis in England means that all areas of the country, including rural areas, must play their part in providing the homes their communities need, and for us to deliver 1.5 million homes. But what I would strongly reject is the idea that through this new formula, we are reducing the amount of houses that need to be built in urban areas. The new formula directs housing growth to our larger urban areas. Now, it does not do so on the basis of an arbitrary 35% urban uplift, as the previous government applied to the 20 largest cities and urban centres. Instead, across city regions, the new standard method increases targets by an average of 20%, all city regions, and through it, housing growth is directed to a wider range of urban areas, so smaller cities and urban areas, as well as the core of large cities. And we think that is a better method on which to proceed. Several honourable members have mentioned the Greenbelt. Ms Jardine, the manifesto on which the government was elected was clear that Greenbelt had an important role to play, and it served our towns and cities very well over many decades in terms of a number of its intentions, including preventing urban sprawl. And this government will always look to brownfield first. Ours is a brownfield first approach. We took measures in the revised NPPF last year to strengthen that approach to brownfield land. We're consulting on a brownfield passport to make it easier to prioritise and accelerate delivery on brownfield land. But we also know, and we've also been very clear, there isn't sufficient land on brownfield registers across the country to build all the homes we need, let alone enough of that land that is viable and in the right location. So we do need to take a different approach to the Greenbelt to ensure it better meets the needs of present and future generations. And what our changes are coming to get, I'll just make this point now, give way to the honourable gentleman. What our changes are intended to ensure is that we go from what was a haphazard approach to the release and development of Greenbelt under the previous government, and plenty of Greenbelt was released in a haphazard way, to a more strategic and targeted approach that ensures that where we are releasing the Greenbelt, we're releasing the right parts of it, so lower quality grey belt land, and that when we do so, golden rules apply, so that there is that quid pro quo for communities in terms of sufficient levels of affordable housing, access to nature and good infrastructure. Happy to give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. And in relation to greenfield development, whether it be in the green belt or outside, If you're talking about rural housing, then clearly green is very often the location on which developments take place. And in the light of that, will the Minister make sure that the government strengthens the ability of local authorities to use the rural exceptions policy? Because we'd rather pay 10 times agricultural value than 100 times agricultural value, because you can't deliver affordable homes on land of that price.
I thank the honourable gentleman for that intervention. I'll come on to rural exception sites specifically. But he does draw attention to an important point, which is it is ultimately for local authorities, and it will be under the revised MPPF, to make these decisions. It is up to local authorities to conduct greenbelt reviews to identify what the grey belt land is in their areas. Government will provide guidance, will provide support with a methodology, but ultimately local areas will be making these decisions through the reviews they carry out. And we've ensured, Ms Jardine, that the sustainability of sites within the Greenbelt must be prioritised. No one wants to see isolated and disconnected development, which is why our policy asks authorities to pay particular attention to transport connections when considering if grey belt is sustainably located. I want to touch briefly on infrastructure. The government recognises that providing the homes and the jobs we need alone is not sufficient to create sustainable, healthy places. Our communities also need to be supported by an appropriate range of services and facilities, as the Right Honourable Gentleman made clear. National planning policy expects local authorities to plan positively for the provision and use of shared spaces, community facilities and other local services to enhance the sustainability of those communities and residential environments, taking into account local strategies to improve health, social and cultural well-being for all sections of the community. The revised MPPF also includes changes intended to ensure that the planning system supports the increased provision and modernisation of key public services infrastructure, such as health, blue light, library, adult education, university and criminal justice facilities. Local authorities, Ms Jardine, should use their development plans to address the needs and opportunities for infrastructure, identify what infrastructure is required and how it can be funded and brought forward. Contributions from developers play an important role in delivering that infrastructure that mitigates the impacts of new development and support growth. And the government is committed to strengthening the existing system of developer contributions to ensure that new developments provide appropriate affordable homes and infrastructure. And we'll set out further details on that matter in due course. I want to touch before winding up, Ms Jardine, on housing targets and national parks, because the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for East Hampshire, knows that I'm well aware of the concerns around housing targets in his constituency and the particular challenges of setting those targets for East Hampshire, given the boundary overlaps with the South Downs National Park. As part of our package of reforms in December 2024, we set out further guidance for local authorities on that very matter, and we provide flexibility in policy for those areas when calculating housing needs and setting targets. Now, the Right Honourable Member knows that this is primarily related to the availability of appropriate data for those areas. Officials in my department regularly engage with officials from the Office of National Statistics and other stakeholders on a range of matters, including on the data and statistics available to make decisions on housing needs. And we'll continue to do so as we drive forward our planning reforms. While we expect all areas to contribute towards our housing ambitions, we also recognise the unique role of national parks. That's why national policy is clear that within national parks, new housing should be focused on meeting affordable housing requirements, supporting local employment opportunities and key services. Just very briefly on rural exception sites, Ms Jardine, we do expect rural exception sites to come forward wherever possible. Policy helps local authorities meet the local housing needs of rural communities, enabling local people, those with a family connection or those with employment connections, to live locally and help sustain thriving places. We want to go further in this regard to better support and increase rural affordable housing. We sought views specifically on this issue as part of the MPPF consultation last summer, and we are committed to consider further measures to support affordable housing in rural communities as part of the work that is underway to produce a set of national policies for decision-making next year. So, in closing, Ms Jardine, I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for East Hampshire once again for giving the House an opportunity to discuss these matters, to other honourable members to taking part in the debate. If any have particular constituency concerns, I'm more than happy to meet with them, but I appreciate them putting their views on the record in this debate.
Damien Hines to wind up.
Thank you, Mrs Jardine. And we've had a good debate today, a constructive one and a thoughtful one. Sincere thanks to the Minister, who is a thoughtful Minister, and I know he does listen and engages very positively. Also, thank you to the opposition spokesman and to all colleagues who have taken part in this debate today. We all recognise that we do need more housing, and we need more housing actually everywhere. Every part of the country has to play its part. We do need a shift within that to the sorts of homes of all tenures, but including first-time buyers in the open market for young families to get on the housing ladder. The targets need to be realistic, given the availability of materials and people to build them, and they need to be accompanied by the critical infrastructure and services that people say to us the whole time at our surgeries. We also do need to make sure that this balance is right between urban areas and rural areas, and I do hope the Minister will reflect further on some of what has been discussed today, not as a NIMBY type of debate, but about making sure that we can maintain our countryside, which is important also for town dwellers as well as for rural dwellers, but also to help the government to deliver on its correct objectives around economic growth and around decarbonisation. Thank you, Mrs Jardine, for presiding over this debate today.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered housing targets in rural areas. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order. Yeah, it says here there will not be an opportunity. Yeah.
Well, no, that's clear. I'll just stop.